She came home a day early from the hospital. The front door sighed shut behind her like the closing of an ordinary afternoon, and for a second the house obeyed the symmetry she had left it in. A pair of slippers by the entry, a stack of city planning books fanned out like evidence of a life resumed, the kettle half full on the stove. Then the scent hit her, perfume that was not hers, and under it something metallic and dry that she couldn't name at first. Money, perhaps, or the faint chemical tang of antiseptic from the hospital blending with the hotel-like air of someone else's presence. Marin felt the aspirin bottle in her bag before she felt the wound again, the tiny mapped ridges of old IV punctures along her wrist, pale blue veins like threads beneath glass. She set the bag down with an almost holy care. The paper on her hospital discharge instructions still sat folded in her notebook. No heavy lifting, follow-up in 2 weeks. She had decided the morning before to come home early. It was a practical decision, Isla's school schedule, the way her mother could not be in the city forever, and an instinct. She had wanted to sleep in her own bed. It was a choice that would later look like luck, or inevitability. In that first thin moment, she only wanted to feel the mattress give beneath her, and the house sound itself out. The bedroom door was ajar. Light, angled through the blinds, cut across the floor, and painted the sheets a hard white. Coffee sat lukewarm in a mug on the nightstand. A silk scarf lay draped over a lamp like a stage prop. On the bureau, a hotel keycard, black with a glossy stripe, caught the light in an obscene little flash. The sight of it stopped something in Marin, the way an impact stops an engine. She thought of Leo's laugh in the kitchen, of the way he leaned into his hands when he was amused, and then she saw the photograph on the bedside table. Leo and her daughter, smiling at the beach last summer, sand between their toes. The photograph was not altered, but somehow the presence of it in a room that had been shared with another person felt like an allegation. Her hands were steady. That steadiness surprised her more than anything. She knew what to do the way she knew how to read plans. In order, grouping, cataloging. The training of a planner and the habits of a lifetime of paperwork made her methodical without choice. She kept 2 movements in mind: do no harm to evidence, protect herself and her child. She reached into her bag and the aspirin bottle clicked like a tiny metronome against the soft thud of her own breath. She did not cry. She opened her mouth to speak, but not even the small syllable of a question left her. She took her phone from her pocket. She photographed the scene, not because she trusted a camera more than memory, because memory is porous and cameras are persuasive.
She moved from object to object. The key card on the nightstand, the scarf, a receipt folded inside the leather cover of a book on the dresser, a small cigarette butt in an ashtray that was not Leo's brand. Each photograph was composed with the same cold insistence, an image of the receipt aligned with the hotel keycard, a close shot of the leather-bound notebook's spine with a pressed flower falling from its pages, the angle of a pillow flattened where 2 people had shared it. She did not take a photograph of the person in the bed. That was not evidence she needed to hold. It was a private collapse she could not exploit even for the sake of fact. It was enough to document the objects that would not forget. In the hallway, her phone vibrated. Catherine's name appeared on the screen. Catherine Holloway, her mother, strategist in repose and in action. Marin swallowed. She hit accept. Marin? Catherine's voice was a short, organized thing, a century of decisions threaded into a single consonant. She heard the faint noise of city life in the background. Mom. Marin let the word hold all the small things, the hospital, the IV, the ache. I'm home. Are you alone? Catherine asked. For the moment, Marin could tell her mother everything in the way she put a hand to the nightstand instead of the pillow. The sound of the phone became small and close. I found there's evidence, receipts, a keycard, a notebook. I've been photographing. I didn't touch his phone. Good. Catherine's voice made not a comfort, but a plan. Stay where you are. Don't change anything more than you already have. Put the camera down in the living room and lock the door. I'm catching a cab. By the time Catherine arrived, the light had shifted, and the house had rearranged itself around the fact of what had been found. Catherine came with a leather portfolio under one arm and a practical scarf, and the air around her acknowledged that she was a woman who had known how to turn an upset into work. She took Marin's hand for a moment, not with theatrical warmth, but with the practical steadiness of someone who could read a weather map. She smelled faintly of bergamot and rain. You acted right, Catherine said as they moved through the rooms. Photographs, no touching. We document what we see. We separate the physical from the digital. When you're done, you'll lock the bedroom and we won't let anyone in but us. You breathe for me. Marin let herself breathe. The rhythm felt like a borrowed thing at first, then returned as if it had just been waiting for permission. They sat at the island in the kitchen. The kettle clicked as it warmed. Its sound was an accountability. Catherine unfolded the leather portfolio, and inside were envelopes, gloves, and a slim pad of evidence labels. Catherine's hands moved with an economy Marin recognized.
This was a woman who could draft a letter and a strategy paper in the same afternoon.
She instructed Marin to place each identified object into its own paper envelope or sealable bag. Paper, not plastic, so nothing would electrostatically cling to anything else. Gloves on, labels applied. Date and time in neat block letters. "You photographed them all?" Catherine asked. "Yes." "Good." Catherine's gaze softened. "We put them away. Lock them in the safe. We keep the phone untouched. We call Lydia." There was the ache again, a clean one now, edged with decision. Marin called Lydia Park, and Lydia answered on the third ring as if she had been waiting. Her voice was brisk and careful, and at once legal and companionate, an attorney who said less and made each sentence carry all the obligations it could. "Do not make any public statement," Lydia instructed. "Do not apologize in public. Do not let him draft the narrative. Start a chain of custody. Document everything. We'll issue a preservation letter to his counsel. Jonas, the tech, call him. Tell him to stand by." "Preservation letter?" Marin repeated, the phrase like a new tool. "An immediate notification," Lydia explained. "We tell them not to delete anything, to preserve devices, accounts, records. It's standard, mostly to prevent spoliation. We can file it electronically, all draft and send it. But first, let us secure what you have. Do you have a sense of dates or times on the receipts?" Marin slid the leather-bound notebook across the counter like a patient. The notebook had a burnished cover, edges softened by thumb. When she opened it, the first pages were not a diarist's confessional, but a ledger. Small blocks of handwriting on coffee-stained paper, lists of names, ledger codes, and numbers written in a tidy hand. There were initials interspersed with what could be acronyms. Somewhere on a page a hotel name was scrawled, the number reversed and underlined. "I don't know half of these codes," Marin said. Her fingers stayed on the page like a hinge. "Good," Lydia said. "Don't transcribe anything yet. Photograph every page, in order. Don't rearrange them. We might need parity between the digital images and the paper. It preserves our chain." The steps were procedural, but every procedure felt like a defensive dignity, the method that stood between private hurt and public reckoning. Marin photographed each page, rotating the notebook so the light did not wash the ink into ambiguity. Catherine sealed the pages into an evidence envelope and labeled it in her block handwriting. Evidence number 1, notebook. Marin signed the label and dated it. The safe in the hall had a combination that only she and Catherine shared. She turned the dial like a small ritual and slid the envelope into the compartment. Isla came home when the day was thinning. She padded in with an exaggerated climb of excitement, school bag slung back over both shoulders, hair pulled into a messy ponytail with a purple band. She saw the locked bedroom with its serious air and asked, "Mom, is Leo here?"
In that candid 9-year-old way that still believed most things could be explained. "We're okay, kiddo," Marin said. She crouched, meeting East-like eye level, so the child would not see the tremor she kept tucked away. "Mom's had a hard day. Your grandmother is here to help. We're going to make some cocoa. Tell me about school." Issa talked about a science project on urban trees, and Marin listened, cataloging the details. The species, the diagrams, the teacher's name, the way a planner catalogs properties and constraints. It grounded her, made her a person with a role again. The child's lightness was a small fortification against the cold facts of the house. Rena Torres arrived before coffee could cool. Rena lived 2 doors down and ran a bakery that smelled perpetually of browned butter. She brought a tin of scones and a softness that was practical rather than sentimental. Rena's eyes were quick and watchful. Neighborhood people learned to recognize the unsaid and to show up anyway. "You need anything?" Rena asked. She did not ask about Leo by name. The unspoken was ample between women in a neighborhood that had knit itself into something like extended kin. "Space," Catherine said, "and patience." "Space and patience," Rena echoed, and put the scones down like a peace offering. Her hand rested for a moment on Isla's shoulder, a tiny transfer of steadiness. They moved through a first triage, photographs in one folder, physical items bagged and labeled, the leather notebook secured. The hotel keycard went into a paper envelope with a label that noted where it was found, and a photograph showing its relation to the nightstand. They photographed the laundry on the bathroom floor, the lipstick mark on a coffee cup's rim, and the ash in the living room ashtray,
but they did not linger on the human presence. The house retained its human traces as evidence, but not a spectacle. When Marin touched the leather notebook for a second time, she felt a quiet, hot clarity. The pages were coded in a way that suggested system. Names or initials on one side, numerical figures on the other. There were transfer notes that might be reimbursements, and in a margin the initials LS appeared adjacent to a line that hinted at a vendor expense. The thought that assembled itself without fanfare was not merely personal betrayal. It was the possibility that private indulgence and public money might be conflated, that funds purportedly for philanthropic or corporate reasons might have been rerouted. The ledger suggested a ledger's worst betrayal, money made legible to the wealthy at the expense of names in a ledger that were not theirs. "You came home a day early," Catherine said softly, as if the short phrase might settle like a bandage. "That matters." Marin felt the sentence as a fact, and then as a sword.
If she had been gone, if she had been in the hospital on schedule, these pages might have been shifted, or the laundry cleaned, or the key card sent somewhere to be disposed of. She had been practical enough to be inconvenient. Lydia's voice came through again to her phone, low and precise. "I'll draft the preservation letter now. Don't make any moves until I call you back. If you want, I'll send a courier to collect the envelopes and custody them. Otherwise, keep them where they are and don't let anyone else handle them." Marin heard herself make decisions in a new register. "We'll keep them here for now. Catherine and I will both sign the labels. We'll coordinate with you for transfer." "Good." Lydia paused, and then for the first time spoke with something like a private steadiness. "Your plan is right. You're doing this the way the law will recognize it later." "That's what I want," Marin said, "for Isla's name to remain clean." Lydia said, "We'll preserve rights to seek accounting. We won't call the press. We'll open discovery in the right way. I'll reach out to a forensic tech. Stand by."
There would be hundreds of other things to catalog in the days to come. Hotel bookings, credit card slips, metadata timestamps, calendar invitations. At that moment, the thing that most demanded Marin's attention was the ledger's quiet insistence that it contained connections. Each notation suggested another name, another transfer, another place where money moved like a ghost across accounts. She felt the ledger as a map and also as a wound. She thought of the city she had planned pieces of, its streets and playgrounds, its small libraries, and the idea that public money might be co-opted into private indulgence felt like a violation that extended beyond her own marriage. It implicated the institutions she had trusted, boards, donors, and the varnished civic rituals where reputations were forged. She thought of the city she had planned pieces of, its streets and playgrounds, its small libraries, and the idea that public money might be co-opted into private indulgence felt like a violation that extended beyond her own marriage. It implicated the institutions she had trusted, boards, donors, and the varnished civic rituals where reputations were forged. Catherine poured tea and watched Marin's face. "When things like this happen," she said, speaking as if conjuring a map through a maze, "people instinctively want to hush. They think silence will heal them. Sometimes silence heals. Other times silence is an alibi." Marin thought of Leo in council meetings, of his easy bow to cameras, of the plaques with his name that had been donated in his honor. She thought of how philanthropy sometimes carries the gloss of a portrait, and how that gloss can shield a lot of small, unpretty things. It occurred to her that the ledger might not only be about an affair, but about the misdirection of image, how reputation was built, and how money was sometimes the mortar behind that image. She called Benjamin with her throat already rehearsed. Benjamin had been a friend for years, an editor at a local paper who wrote with discretion and a careful eye for the facts. She didn't want an expose as a first move. She wanted context. She wanted someone who knew the cadence of public accountability to help her think through the risks of going public and the protections she would need for Isla and for herself. "Are you safe?" Benjamin asked, after a short silence at the other end of the line, as if to place a first floor of concern before any of the rest of the building. "I am," Marin said, "for now." "Don't do anything yet," he said. "I'll stand by. I can reach out to sources quietly. Hotel records, event staff, vendors. But not without your okay. You call the shots." "Thank you," she said, meaning it. There was a gravity to having an ally who was neither kin nor counsel, but who understood the mechanics of the public record. Night settled, and with it the first slow paperwork of grief. Lists, boxes, formalities that lent shape to an otherwise amorphous hurt. Marin wrote 3 lists, things to do immediately, things to ask Lydia, and things to safeguard for Isla. She wrote the lists in the planner she had kept through her hospital stay. Her handwriting was small and deliberate.
She slept in short fits, waking each time to the siren of a passing ambulance or the small human sounds that made a house feel inhabited.
Morning brought a procedural clarity. Marin and Catherine photographed the notebook again for redundancy. It was always better to have multiple images than to trust memory. They labeled files with date and timestamps, and Catherine typed up a brief memo of actions taken. Lydia's preservation letter arrived by noon, precise and courteous, copied to a counsel whose name Marin had never paid attention to on meetings. The letter instructed the preservation of documents and communications, demanded a hold on deletion, and reserved the right for further action. Marin felt a small, ecstatic relief when she read the legal formality. Its contours promised process, and process promised that her story could be made legible in a system that recognized evidence. They made a plan. Do not go public, preserve everything, find a forensic technician to image devices forensically, a complete bit-for-bit copy so the original device remained untouched, and gather financial statements through counsel. Lydia recommended a name, Jonah Reed, his reputation for technical care precise as a surgeon's. Marin sent an email with the ledger images attached and a line, "Stand by, we will need imaging support." Jonah answered with quick schematic questions about the devices present, and a note that he had a small team who could come the next day to image any devices. His reply contained the word hash in parentheses for what it meant, a digital fingerprint of a file that would prove if a file had been altered later. Marin wrote the term down, liking it for its concreteness. To make something immutable, that was the thin premise on which she would rebuild a personal narrative she had not expected to have to defend. In the late afternoon, as the sky put on a color that had the thinness of a cheap photograph, Marin sat with the leather-bound notebook open in front of her and read again. There was a line that recurred, donor dinner next to a number, Valentina down below with an amount, Valentina. The name fit like a color in a painting she had only half noticed. It could have been coincidence, a cross-channel of social contacts. It could have been something else. Catherine watched her. "You can do two things," she said gently. "You can make this small, private, and keep your life separate. Or you can say it matters to you how money is used and that you will not be quiet. Which matters more?" Marin thought of the places she had worked in the city. A community center with a leaky roof that had been patched again and again because donors liked seeing their names on bronze plaques. A playground that had the wrong color for accessibility ramps until a small grant changed minds. She thought of Isla's school and the children who made plans with crayons, and it dawned on her that her decision would be not only about personal pain, but about civic claim. "I don't know yet," she said. The truth of it felt honest because it was not yet an instrument or a defense. It was a question.
"You don't have to decide tonight," Catherine said, "but decide on the next step. Who will physically hold the evidence? Who will stand beside you at the beginning?" They signed the labels again. They placed the envelopes in the safe. They wrote down names for witnesses, Rena for neighborhood presence, Tomas Rivera, Leo's bank contact, who might be called later by counsel, Benjamin on standby for careful media vetting. They made a list of potential ethical pitfalls, speaking out of turn, letting emotion shape public narrative, exposing Isla. After the safe clicked shut, Marin sat on the stairs and let the quiet in. The house hummed in ordinary ways, the refrigerator's low vibration, the neighbor's radio through the wall. She touched her wrist where the IV marks still faintly showed, and thought of the fragility that had led her to be at home a day early. She felt gratitude, strange, layered, with the rawness of betrayal. The thought that had arrived like a tide was simple and unromantic. Evidence mattered. Someone had to make the private record speak if the public record was going to listen. That night she did something small and intimate. She fetched the box of Isla's old drawings from the closet and spread them on the kitchen table as if making a collage. Isla crouched beside her, sorting buildings from trees. Marin drew a small line, an imaginary street, connecting the drawn playground to a drawn library. "We'll make this street better," Isla said with the certainty only a child can have. Marin smiled and felt a clean commendant for him. This would be a life rebuilt not only for herself and her daughter, but for the neighborhood that had stitched itself quietly to her survival. The ledger on the kitchen table was not the whole story. It was the first stone she could put down and say, "This is where I begin." Before she slept, she opened the leather-bound notebook once more, photographing a page that contained a notation she had not yet decoded. A name, an amount. Next to it, a shorthand that looked like a reference number. The notation felt like a hinge. She sent the image to Lydia with the message, "This might be important. We'll talk in the morning." Around midnight, after the lights had been turned off and the house had surrendered itself to the hush of residential life, Marin sat in the dark and listened to the hush. It was a different kind of quiet than the antiseptic stillness of the hospital. It had warmth to it, the small murmur of a neighborhood sleeping. She thought about the decisions that stood ahead, what to tell the board members, how to shape a public apology if one was necessary, the rhythm of depositions and discovery, the practical timeline of seeking accountings.
She pictured the ledger as a map, and on that map she began to write a small legend in her head, names matched to potential witnesses, dates cross-checked with receipts.
She imagined Jonah's forensic imaging, the way a bit-for-bit copy would make an original device inviolable. She imagined Lydia drafting a preservation letter, and the way institutions would react when legal formality quietly set a tide in motion. She slept in short surfings, waking to the sound of Isla's small footfalls on the way to the bathroom, to the kettle clicking as it was set for tea. The next day promised to be about expertise, technical, legal, journalistic. The part of her that was a planner loved the list-like clarity of the work ahead. The part that was a mother loved the small, stubborn human detail, Isla's crayon drawings, the way Rena had left extra scones in a tin. Morning light poured through the kitchen windows, and Marin realized the ledger's pages had one more thing to offer. They had handwriting that matched a note she remembered seeing in a file at the foundation Leo attended to, a cross that might suggest the same hand had guided various entries. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that with every photo and every sealed envelope, the house became less a hiding place and more a repository of truth. She had come home a day early, and the house had answered with proof. She stood in the kitchen and dialed Jonah Reed's number. His voice over the line was calm and technical, and slightly amused at being assigned an emotional case. "We do an image," he said plainly. "We make a copy that is forensic, bit for bit. Then we create a hash. That hash proves later whether files were changed. We document chain of custody from the moment the device is moved. If you want, I can come by tomorrow morning to image devices while your attorney watches." "Tomorrow morning is fine," Marin said. "Bring gloves and your kit. We'll have everything ready." "Bring coffee," Jonah added, and there was a warmth to the line that Marin laughed despite everything. She ended the call and placed the leather-bound notebook into the safe once more. She closed the lid and turned the dial, feeling the mechanical certainty of closed metal. The click sounded louder, resonant with the kind of finality that was not absolution, but a beginning of process. Outside, the city made small noises, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking twice and then quiet. Inside, the house held its secret and its newly gathered evidence. Marin thought again of the hospital, the day-early return that had pivoted everything, and felt a quiet gratitude that had nothing to do with living through pain and everything to do with the plain arithmetic of choice. If she had not come home that afternoon, these details might have been scrubbed away in service of someone's reputation. Instead, they sat in photographed clarity, waiting. At noon, Lydia arrived, brisk and professional, and immediately into the language of legal steps, preservation letters, potential subpoenas, the mechanics of discovery. She looked at the photographs, nodded, and then at the notebook. "This will be useful in an accounting," she said. "We need to trace these entries. We will need to compare them to bank records and to corporate expense reports." Marin felt a cautious satisfaction. The work ahead would be long and granular, and it comforted her in a way she hadn't expected, that here was an apparatus, law, technology, journalism, that could translate private record into public principle. The ledger might require forensic accounting. The hotel keycard could be matched to logs. The cigarette brand might be cross-referenced to a witness. The sum of small things could become a structure that would either confirm or exonerate what she feared. As Lydia began to draft the next moves, Marin slid the last photo of the nightstand into an envelope and sealed it. The photograph showed the hotel keycard, the coffee mug, and the framed picture of Isla in the same frame. The image felt like a sentence, private life bleeding into public symbol. Catherine watched her, eyes steady. "Sometimes the proof is small," she said. "Sometimes it's in the way a receipt is folded, in the date stamped on a keycard. Small things can dismantle a reputation, and if you let them, they can rebuild a better one." Marin looked at the photograph and then at the notebook, and for the first time in days the feeling in her chest steadied into something like resolve. She had come home a day early. The house had given her evidence, and evidence made questions into questions cities could answer. She would not let the ledger become merely a domestic artifact. She would not let her child's life be the collateral of another person's reputation. She would examine each page, find the links, and follow them not with vendetta, but with the civic diligence she had always prized. They made plans for the next day. Jonah would image devices. Lydia would issue letters and begin to seek records. Benjamin would check sources quietly. Rena would bake for long office hours. Tomas, if he needed to be contacted, would be handled through counsel, carefully and in sequence. Marin wrote the names down as if they were tools,
a technical fix, a legal mechanism, a source with a conscience. Before Lydia left, he asked one simple question. Marin, do you want to go public? Marin's mouth made a small shape. Public meant exposure. It also meant accountability. Not now, she said. Not until we know what we have. Not until we can show the pattern. This isn't about spectacle. It's about whether money was used as a private ledger. Then let's be surgical, Lydia said. We will gather, we will document, and then we will decide. That night, Marin traced Isla's small hand on a sheet of paper, wrote the child's name in large bubble letters, and slipped it into the leather notebook. It was a small ceremonial act, an insertion of family into evidence that had to date been only transactions and receipts. She closed the notebook and felt the weight of it like a promise.
The ledger was not the totality of her life. It was a portion she would render legible. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea cooling beside her and thought of the various small moments that had led to this night. The aspirin bottle clack in her bag, the hotel key's glossy flash, the smell of perfume. She thought of the city's insistence that things be built to last and how sometimes the public gestures of durability masked small fissures. Marin ran her thumb across the safe's cool metal and imagined the sequence that would follow. Jonah's careful imaging, Lydia's precise language, Ben's restraint and later courage in reporting facts without sensation, Catherine's strategic patience. She imagined depositions like a slow rain that made the ledger's ink run toward daylight. She imagined the gala, an institution event where Leo would be lauded, becoming a place where the ledger's presence could not be ignored. The idea of the gala had a theatrical charge to it, but tonight it was only that, an image she would hold in reserve. She felt, very quietly and not yet loudly, that the decision to act would have to be less about retribution than about restoring a thin thing called public trust. It was a large moral task pressed into an intimate domestic scene. She had come home a day early, and now she would turn the small factual bones of that afternoon into a structure that could hold argument. She would do it with the same care she gave a plan for a neighborhood: measure, consult, and ultimately build something that served more than one person's ego. The house exhaled around her. Marin tucked the leather-bound notebook under her arm and carried it to the safe one more time. The dial clicked. She remembered the hospital band that still clanged faintly to her wrist, the small strip of paper that marked a patient's passage. Now she had her own marks, the careful lists, the sealed envelopes, the names of allies in her phone. The wounds of betrayal did not heal in a single measure, but they could be made legible, and legibility was often the first step toward repair. A final photograph lay on the kitchen counter, the nightstand shot with Isla's picture in the frame, the hotel keycard. A final photograph lay on the kitchen counter, the nightstand shot with Isla's picture in the frame, the hotel keycard gleaming at its edge, the coffee mug's lipstick ring like a punctuation. If this moment feels familiar to you, if the small details prick at something you know, leave one sentence starting with "I would say." It will help hold this story in the shape of what matters. The next morning arrived with a grayness that felt purposeful rather than cruel. Jonah Reed stepped into the house with a small duffel of equipment and a readiness that made the kitchen table feel less like a crime scene and more like an operations center. He was young in the way of people who have seen too many devices to be surprised by any particular model, but with a steadiness that carried the old confidence of someone who had learned to be skeptical of appearances. He set his kit down gently, unzipped compartments, and pulled out a black anodized box, the right blocker, that would be the device's guard against alteration. He worked with layered motions, gloves on, a sterile mat laid where the phone and Leo's laptop would be placed, evidence tags ready to affix. Lydia watched in professional silence, pen poised, while Catherine hovered near the doorway in the way of family strategists who trust expertise but refuse to be out of the loop. "We'll do an image," Jonah said, matter of fact. "Not a backup, a bit-for-bit copy. That preserves every fragment and slack in the file system. We don't touch originals after the copy. We label everything, put the originals in sealed evidence bags, and log every transfer." Marin watched, her hands folded under her chin. The words themselves were small comforts. Image, hash, custody. Each one meant that the house's evidence would be legible to others who had not stood in the bedroom doorway and smelled perfume at noon. Jonah explained the next steps as he worked. "We'll place any mobile devices in Faraday bags for a moment to block remote wipes, then connect through the right blocker to a laptop that will create a forensic image. We'll generate a hash, a cryptographic fingerprint, that proves the copy is identical to the original.
Later, if someone claims files were tampered with, the hash will show us whether anything changed. We also log timestamps on every action and witness signatures on the chain of custody form. He moved with careful choreography. Marin watched him write the serial numbers into a logbook. Each notation was a stitch in the armor she was assembling. When he produced a printable chain of custody sheet and placed it on the counter, Lydia signed without hesitation. Catherine added her signature in heavy block letters. Marin hesitated only briefly before placing her name beneath theirs. The ink felt small and indelible. On Jonah's laptop, a status bar crept across the screen as though the slow movement of data were a second heartbeat. The imaging took hours. They let it run while the neighborhood murmured beyond the windows. A child's laughter, the tinny music of someone mowing a lawn. Jonah made tea and offered Marin a cup. "Coffee's good if you want to stay awake while this runs," he said. Marin sipped, thinking about how ordinary the world seemed outside the glass. While imaging proceeded, Lydia made calls. She confirmed the preservation letter had been sent and formally served Leo's counsel. She requested records from the Foundation's finance office and drafted subpoenas to banking institutions should informal cooperation fail.
She spoke to Tomas Rivera's office quietly through the firm's channels, asking for provisional information about account holders and the existence or absence of supporting invoices for certain transfers. Lydia's voice was quiet but exacting. When she finished a call, she would compress what had been said into a shorthand that made Marin feel the room's air tilt toward resolution. Benjamin had been in touch with hotel staff overnight. He brought with him a thin stack of printouts, a list of check-ins and check-outs, a staff log that pin-cushioned the hotel's memory of the night, and a scanned photocopy of a credit card authorization slip that matched the receipt found in the leather notebook. He explained, without flourish, that small institutions like hotels keep meticulous guest logs for liability reasons. They'll tell us who used the key that night and whether any room service orders match the timestamps on the ledger, he said. "I'll be discreet. I know the lines we don't cross." Rena, who had stopped by to see how Marin and Isla were coping, offered neighborhood corroboration. She could testify that Leo had been seen leaving the house the morning the receipt was dated, carrying a leather portfolio that matched the one Catherine had brought, and that the ashtray used an imported brand she recognized from behind her bakery counter. Her testimony was not decisive on its own, but it was the kind of local texture that made the ledger's numbers into lived behavior. As the day unfolded, the work became rhythm. Image, hash, log, phone call, preservation letter, witness list. Quiet conversations with Tomas on the procedural edge of banker courtesy. There were moments that felt almost bureaucratic in their ordinariness, the kind of thing Marin, as a planner, had always loved, systems working the way they ought to. She found herself taking notes in the margins of the leather-bound notebook, as if it were now a tool in the public interest, rather than a private ledger of someone else's choices. Jonah completed the imaging. He printed the hash strings and explained, in a spare aside intended as reassurance, how they would be used. If we show later that the audio file played at the gala is bit for bit identical to what's in this image, and if the hash matches, then technically it's the same file. There's no clean way to say someone altered it after we sealed it up. His fingers tapped the chain of custody log, a tiny drumbeat. "We'll keep originals locked. Copies for you if you want them to review." They placed the original devices in an evidence locker, and Jonah took one copy on a secure drive that would be encrypted and stored off-site. The attention to the small details, labels, signatures, time-stamped emails to counsel acknowledging receipt, was tedious and therefore beautiful. It felt like constructing a building with precisely calibrated bolts. Nothing in the structure would be left to rust through neglect.
There were moments of negotiation over process. Leo's counsel, who answered Lydia's query with a practiced neutrality, requested cooperation and insisted that their client would be helpful. Lydia responded with the language of law. Preservation is not an invitation to convenience. Helpful is irrelevant, she said firmly, in a voice that steeled Marin. We need compliance and formal documentation. Please have your client confirm in writing the preservation of emails, calendars, and expense reports. Late in the day, a courier arrived with copies of corporate expense ledgers, provided under a cautious internal review. A few numbers in the corporate ledger matched the amounts in the leather-bound notebook. The descriptors were glossier there: vendor entertainment, donor engagement, sponsorship. But the supporting invoices were missing or cross-referenced with shorthand codes that did not immediately clarify what had been paid. Lydia's hands moved faster, reconstructing the likely chain. A corporate expense moved, recorded behind a code, and then a private ledger attached notes that more precisely described the recipient. "They're messy," Lydia said, looking up from the printouts. "Not unusual. Accounting often uses summary codes. That doesn't mean it's illegal, but it does mean there's work to do. We'll need itemized receipts and vendor contracts. If they can't provide those, we'll have a strong inference that funds were mischaracterized. The thought that wound itself quietly through Marin was less legal and more civic. Reputations are built on stories that organizations tell about themselves, and where public trust is given, plaques, dedications, honors, money has a way of being the slate underneath. Her mind returned, unbidden, to the playground and the small library roofs she had fought to secure funding for, and she felt the ledger's implications like a cold, clean responsibility. Over the next week, the group's work spread outward in concentric waves. Lydia issued targeted subpoenas, Jonah imaged additional devices and examined metadata, showing that certain calendar invites had been created and deleted within hours of the transfers noted in the notebook. Priya Desai, a forensic audio technician Lydia brought onto the team, worked with Jonah to analyze an audio file Lydia had obtained from an unknown source, a 10-second clip whose provenance was murky, but whose content, when authenticated, would make the ledger's implications undeniable. Priya's work was careful and scientific. She explained to Marin, in tones that were both technical and humane, how she would proceed. First, we check the file's metadata, timestamps, sample rates, file container, she said. Then we look for any edits, abrupt changes in background noise, dropouts. If the file came from a phone, we compare it to the phone image we have and match the hash.
If everything lines up, we can say whether it's consistent with having been recorded at that time and place. We'll also compare the audio signature to known samples to make sure voice identification is done conservatively. That conservative approach, cautious, procedural, refusing to be swept into drama, suited Marin. She wanted the facts to be implacable, not theatrical. She wanted the evidence to carry the moral weight without her having to make spectacle of private grief. Benjamin's quiet diligence produced corroborating maps, hotel logs that linked keycard numbers to dates and room numbers, restaurant invoices that matched times, vendor emails that, when pulled through counsel, revealed the shorthand lines that matched the notebook's entries. He and Lydia walked a tight line between public interest and private detail, ensuring that any disclosure would be defensible both factually and ethically. Meanwhile, the social climate around Leo shifted with the kind of subtlety that means reputations begin to unravel not in a single dramatic tear, but in a texture of small retractions. Board members who had once accepted his statements with applause began to schedule executive sessions. Event planners who had booked him for speaking engagements sent notes focused on logistics rather than promotion. The philanthropic community, which depended on optics as much as funds, started asking questions in private. Lydia's preservation letter and the subpoenas operated like a sluice. They did not make a public decision, but they made it harder for institutions to ignore the ledger's shadow. Marin and Catherine met with Elise Marchetti, the gala curator, in a cafe with wallpaper like a soft ledger. Elise's world was a choreography of light and attention, and she listened to Marin without grand gestures, touching only the rim of a coffee cup as she considered logistics. "Your timing is a risk," Elise said. "The gala will be full of people who will judge the method as much as the message." "I know," Marin said, "but the gala is the place where the ledger's consequences and the symbolism of his honors intersect. If we have authenticated material that connects public recognition to questionable bookkeeping, then that moment is where the institution can either stand by their process or be reminded they must answer to it." Elise nodded slowly. "If you go, the reveal must be surgical, no theatrics, a clear presentation, a factual statement, the artifacts shown with provenance, no sensationalism. We'll need legal sightlines cleared. Security will need notice." They rehearsed contingencies. What if Leo refused to attend? What if his counsel tried to stop the presentation? What if press tried to record Isla? The ethical friction, exposing a private betrayal in public space when a child was involved, occupied Marin more than any legal wrinkle.
Lydia insisted on a plan that protected Isla. The child would not be present at any public reveal, and any family statements would be brief and firm, leaving the bulk of the factual narrative to counsel and technical witnesses. Isla's school continued to be a small harbor. Marin taught a short unit on civic planning for her child's class as a way of anchoring normalcy. She explained in simple terms how cities needed oversight and how people who cared for a place could make sure its gifts went where they were promised. Isla, who loved drawing streets and labeling parks, absorbed it with the pliant faith of a child, and Marin felt a quiet moral steadiness in that exchange that made the days of legal work feel less like revenge and more like stewardship. Word, as it will in tight urban circles, began to press against Leo. He convened meetings with his own counsel and prepared the public statements of a man practiced at self-presentation. He released a measure of equivocal contrition in private, a public statement that praised the city and emphasized the importance of transparency. He did not admit wrongdoing. He offered an openness to inquiry and left the rest for others to read. The tone was strategic. Avail yourself of civil niceties while resisting legal admission.
That would not stand alone. When Priya's analysis confirmed the audio's metadata, and Jonah's hash matched the image taken at Marin's home, the team had what Lydia described as a compact package, synchronized artifacts that tied an entry in the leather-bound notebook to a recorded action and to a financial transfer. Benjamin prepared a careful dossier for Elise that explained what could be presented publicly and what needed to remain within the frame of litigation. It took days of dry, focused work to render the material into the language of a public moment, images with provenance, audio with certified chain of custody, and a ledger whose numbers could be traced to bank entries. The night of the gala arrived with the usual perfumed intensity of civic pomp. Candles in glass bowls attenuated the chandelier's glare. Panels of donors and city officials wore the satin armor of civic ceremony. Marin did not go in with vengeance in her posture. She wore a dark dress, simple, a coat her mother had insisted on to guard against chill. Isla slept at her grandmother's apartment with a neighbor on call. Catherine sat with her at the curb until the last minute, reading a press release's hard copy and offering a last pragmatic kiss on Marin's forehead. "You don't have to speak," Catherine said. "You only need to be present in the way you have been here, precise and unhurried." Marin's walk into the hall was like stepping into a map she had helped shape. She felt the waft of roses and the clink of glass, and the low, expectant hum of people trying to enjoy themselves, while their attention flickered to those who were about to be honored.
The gala had a stage at one end and a projection screen the size of a small building. Elise met her backstage with a folder and the smallest of smiles. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as I can be," Marin said. Her voice felt steady. She had rehearsed her statement, but she would let Lydia and the technicians do the technical show. Her role would be the moral frame, to say why the night mattered and why truth mattered more than reputation. The presentation began with an ordinary film reel about civic work, a montage of parks, renovated libraries, the very institutions Marin had held dear. It warmed the room into a mood of pride. Then the lights shifted and the tone narrowed. Elise introduced Lydia, who read a carefully crafted preface about public trust and the need for institutions to be accountable when questions arise about the use of funds. Lydia's voice echoed in the hall. "Tonight we stand not to defame a person, but to insist on the public principle that where civic honors and philanthropy cross, transparency must follow." Benjamin took a measured, on-the-record approach to narrate 2 slides. First, the image of the hotel keycard with the ledger's adjacent notation. Second, the extract of the ledger where Valentina and amounts were listed beside shorthand references. He explained the provenance, the physical keycard found in Marin's home, photographed and time-stamped, the ledger page photographed and sealed into evidence, the corporate ledger slips that set the same amounts in an internal summary. Priya took the microphone for the audio demonstration. She had prepared a visual of the waveform to project, a small peak at the 32-second mark, a background hum that matched the hotel clip's mechanical air conditioning. She played the authenticated 10-second clip. It was short and, in isolation, unremarkable. Voices, a laugh, a phrase that referenced a room number, a time. But when paired with the ledger entry and the hotel check-in log Benjamin had obtained, the small sound was like a hinge closing. Lydia explained how Priya's lab had matched the file's hash to the image Jonah had made of the device Marin had turned over. Jonah displayed the immutable hash on the screen and walked the audience through what it meant in plain terms. The audio file had been preserved from the original device, and its content dated consistent with the ledger's timing. The room's atmosphere changed in a way that was at once polite and seismic. Murmurs rose at the back. Servers stopped mid-stride. Immediately after the audio played, a projected timeline marched across the screen. Ledger entry, hotel check-in, bank transfer. Each dot on the line had an anchor of evidence, receipts, logs, hashes. The narrative was not a melodrama. It was a sterile, judicial chorus, yet it asked a moral question that could not be felled by curt denial. Why had public-oriented funds been recorded in shorthand and paired with private entries?
Leo, who had been on stage earlier as the evening's honoree, sat rigid where dignitaries do, face a practiced mask of composure. When the projections reached the point where amounts matched transfers in corporate ledgers and invoices were absent, he rose from his chair and walked to the podium with the precise gait of someone who had long rehearsed how a city honors its own. He spoke with the calm cadence of a rehearsed apology. "I welcome inquiry," he said, voice measured. "I have always loved this city and its institutions. I will cooperate fully. I regret that private affairs have bled into public perception." His phrasing avoided the word mistake,
and invited the reading that citizenship requires both charity and inquiry. Some players in the audience exhaled as if a script had been followed, others did not. After his statement, there was an immediate, visible ripple. Board members whispered. A few people stood and left, not squealing in triumph, but adjusting their seats as if recalculating where to place themselves. Elise watched the rear doors the way one watches a tide, when Valentina, who had been at the periphery of earlier programs, rose and fled down a back corridor, eyes downcast. The moment took on the flavor of a private retreat made public. The night's posturing turned quickly toward institutional responses. The philanthropic board that had listed Leo's name on a plaque scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day. An honorary portrait that had hung in a municipal building was quietly removed and wrapped for reassessment. News outlets that had long invited him on panels began requesting documents rather than quotes. The gala's social pages would later reflexively note the evening's awkwardness, but the substantive aftermath unfolded in rooms of counsel and finance officers who had suddenly found the ledger's presence an urgent problem. Marin left before the ceremony's after-party, escorted by Catherine and Jonah. She did not need to watch the rest of the night's social dance. She had done what she set out to do, present the facts in a way that the public institutions could not ignore, and that preserved, above spectacle, the integrity of the process. The following weeks were an unglamorous law of work: depositions, discovery demands, the patient grinding of document production. Discovery pulled open the ledger's neater knots. Depositions forced witnesses to testify in public record, under oath, about the existences of invoices, approvals, and the internal codes that had been used to classify certain transfers. In a deposition room, under fluorescent light and the small cruelty of a camera's lens, some of the most revealing exchanges took place. The transcript read like a stripped-down exchange between fact and obfuscation. Lydia, with a gentle firmness, asked Tomas Rivera about a series of transfers. "Mr. Rivera, can you identify payer and payee for the transfers dated June 12th, 13th, and 14th?
Tomas, who had been Leo's banking relationship manager and who had a habit of speaking slowly, as if buying time, turned the pages he had been provided. The transfers were coded as vendor payments, he said. The payee names were registered under corporate vendor accounts. Did you receive, at the time of those transfers, itemized invoices showing services rendered to the corporation? Lydia asked. No, Tomas replied hesitantly. There were internal memos that referenced events and hospitality. It was not unusual for some payments to be aggregated. Lydia's pen moved then, as if the physical motion translated hesitation into evidentiary momentum. The exchange did not scream what had happened. It dressed the ledger's doubts in institutional procedure. Each equivocation tightened a knot. Leo was deposed too. He answered in the practiced rhythms of someone accustomed to being on stage and asked to be precise. He denied knowledge of any improper use of corporate funds for personal purposes, and yet when pressed about the shorthand in the corporate ledger, he hedged. I entrusted certain expense oversight to staff. When Lydia followed up asking which staff and whether policy required itemized receipts, the answer skirted from delegation into a fog of operational practice. These depositions, public in their formal record though not necessarily front-page theater, accumulated like small planks across a gulf. They were not, on their own, indictments. They were part of a civil architecture that would allow the possibility of an accounting. The ledger's numbers were no longer merely suggestive. They began to map onto real financial streams that the foundation and the corporation would have to explain. There were moments in the legal grind that tested Marin's patience and her moral compass. Requests for production could be met with delay tactics. Counsel for the other side filed motions that sought protective orders. Some friends counseled her to seek the fastest, loudest route. Others advised quiet negotiation. Lydia favored the careful path: pursue discovery, preserve reputational fairness for all, and prepare the public frame only when there was a clean narrative to tell. Negotiations began in earnest. Without pretending to be a courtroom drama, the settlement conversations were real, lawyers exchanging terse memos, offers, and counteroffers. The parties discussed restitution for mischaracterized expenditures, the establishment of an independent accounting review of the Foundation's past grants, and the creation of a transparency mechanism for future philanthropic recognition in the city. Leo's team argued for a limited resolution that would avoid admission of wrongdoing. Lydia pressed for institutional remedies and for a fund that would direct resources toward the neighborhoods most affected by past allocation choices. They found a meeting of practical moral economies. The eventual settlement, negotiated rather than adjudicated,
included the establishment of a publicly administered fund with independent oversight focused on scholarships for women in urban planning, a transparent grant-making process with published criteria, and an independent audit of the foundation's recent grants. The city also agreed to explore an ordinance that would require disclosure of donor and honoree relationships in civic recognition ceremonies, a measure aimed not at punishing an individual so much as creating structural clarity. The settlement did not claim criminal guilt. It was not a dramatic confession. Instead, it was a material reweaving. Money redirected, oversight instituted, names removed from certain honorary plaques pending audit. Boards that had been slow to interrogate private contributions began convening to revise policies, seeking to ensure that the public recognitions they bestowed were undergirded by transparent accounts. Leo, who had been held to a degree of reputational accountability, stepped back from certain public-facing roles while the reviews took place. The narrative was not a triumphal cleansing so much as a negotiation of consequence and restitution. In the months that followed, Marin turned the private ledger's pressure into public construction. The foundation that emerged from the settlement took a clear mission: to fund urban projects where a transparent allocation process would be part of the grant agreement. Marin insisted that the foundation disclose reports and make grant criteria public. She insisted on independent oversight. She demanded that scholarship recipients be selected through panels that included community representatives as well as professionals. The fund's first cohort of scholarship recipients were women studying urban planning and community design, young practitioners whose work would be invested in the neighborhoods Marin loved. Catherine became the foundation's interim advisor, bringing her practical mind to governance meetings. Jonah and Priya offered pro bono services to community organizations seeking to understand how to preserve records and maintain transparency. Benjamin wrote a measured feature that did not aim to humiliate, but to describe how systems of honor sometimes outpaced systems of accountability. Rena's Bakery hosted the foundation's first small convening. Her scones became the quiet pastry of practical change. The city's ordinance, drafted by a coalition of council members, civil society leaders, and Marin herself, required public disclosure of substantial gifts attached to plaques and honors, and a registry of conflicts of interest for civic recognitions. It didn't erase the past, but created structures that would make future gifts legible. The Municipal Ethics Office expanded its capacity to review civic donor agreements, and a handful of city boards revised their policies to require independent audit for large honors that included monetary components.
At home, the household's rhythms settled into a new, less brittle pattern. Marin taught a workshop at the community center about participatory budgeting. She sat on panels about urban resilience and about the ethics of philanthropy and public life. Ela, who loved to draw streets, joined a small civic club at school that met in the community room of the new foundation office. She learned the names of materials used in community gardens and helped design a small poster about neighborhood engagement. Marin watched her daughter's interest bloom into a practical curiosity for how public spaces are funded and maintained. The child's drawings, pinned now in the foundation office's hallway, felt less like private talismans and more like a public claim. There were quieter personal recoveries, too. Marin and Catherine rebuilt rituals around the little things: Saturday mornings when they would shop for paint swatches for a community room, Sunday evenings when they would co-write grant applications by the kitchen light. The house's rooms, once a site of betrayal, gradually became places of convening. They opened a back room for neighborhood meetings, a place with a corkboard, some folding chairs, and a kettle that never stopped offering tea. When neighbors came, they brought practical concerns and sometimes fragile trust. The room, in its modest utility, became a small public good. The ledger, the leather-bound book that had catalyzed the entire sequence, was placed under the foundation's custody for a time and then archived with a public note about the functions it had served in the legal process. Marin often caught herself walking past the archive box and thinking about the house's kitchen counter photograph. She had come home a day early from the hospital, and that choice had altered the line of events not only in her marriage but in her community's public life. She did not mistake the settlement for complete victory. She knew the measures were partial and the hurt residual. There were days when the house's quiet would fold into a heaviness she could only name as loss. Leo continued to live in the city's social orbit in subtler ways, and some alliances remained unchanged. But the institutions that had once accepted reputations without inquiry were changed in small but enduring ways. New procedures, new audits, a registry of disclosed gifts that meant donors and honorees were less likely to hide behind glossy plaques. The foundation's first grants were awarded to projects that looked like the neighborhood Marin had fought to make whole: a tiny library roof fixed with transparent reporting,
a community-led playground whose board minutes were published online, a scholarship that sent 2 young women to accredited urban planning programs.
At the opening of the refurbished playground, children with newly accessible ramps shouted across slides while parents watched, small faces flushed with the kind of civic pride Marin had always imagined but rarely seen when bureaucracy overshadowed boots on the ground. On a late autumn evening, after a day of meetings, Marin walked home with Isla and Rena trailing behind with a box of pastries. The house warmed around them. In the living room, the community room's corkboard held sketches from the recent participatory budgeting round. Someone had pinned a child's comic of a city where every bench had a plaque describing who had paid for it. Marin smiled at the absurdity and the hope of it both. Catherine sat at the kitchen table going over a new grant proposal with a light in her eyes that was not merely maternal. "We made something of it," she said without looking up. "A ledger, a foundation, an ordinance. People will forget how small the pivot was. They'll say this city always cared, but you remember coming home early." Marin touched the faint blue of the IV marks on her wrist and thought of the fragile way decisions build consequences. "I remember," she said, "and I remember the work it took to make these things matter." Isla came into the kitchen with a folded piece of construction paper. "Look," she said, with the solemnity only 9-year-olds can wear when offering something they believe will matter. Her crayon drawing showed a street, with small squares for houses, a large tree labeled Community Tree, and a tiny plaque next to it that read, in Isla's careful letters, "Remember Truth." Marin took the drawing and taped it to the corkboard above the kettle. She felt something steady as she watched the small paper flattened on the wall, a simple, stubborn testament. Nearby, a framed photograph showed Isla at the beach with Leo months before. Marin covered the photo with a neutral frame and chose instead to center a new image, a planting day in the community garden where neighbors were seen working together, hands muddied, sleeves rolled up. The frame made a statement of its own. Over time, Leo's public calendar dimmed in parts, and some of his honors were reconsidered, not as acts of revenge, but as institutions doing the work of adjusting to evidence. He attended some required meetings during the settlement's review period, and then retreated to private life, occasionally issuing statements that framed his actions in terms of regret and a commitment to reflection. The moral texture of the city had shifted not by legal annihilation, but by the slow accretion of transparency. At the Foundation's first annual public review, Marin spoke plainly. She told a room full of grant applicants, board members, neighborhood representatives, and students the careful story of how the ledger had been found and what it had taught them. She did not dramatize her pain. She described process, responsibility, and the people who had partnered in the work. She introduced the scholarship recipients and the small civic projects that the grants had supported. Her voice was the one she had used since the hospital, measured, exacting, full of practical tenderness. The room listened in a way that resembled civic attention, undramatic, patient, focused. A council member in the back nodded, a local teacher wiped a small tear, and a young woman receiving a scholarship lifted her head with the relieved gravity of someone who had been given space to practice her craft. When the event ended, the crowd spilled into the Foundation's community room for coffee, and a child ran past carrying a paper model of a bench with a plaque labeled, in shaky letters, "What We Deserve." Marin watched the small frenzy and felt, very quietly, the shape of repair. Months later, on a soft Sunday when the light came through the blinds at an angle that made the rooms glow like pages in a book, Marin sat on the stoop with Isla, sipping tea. They watched people pass, neighbors fetching mail, someone walking a dog, a group of teenagers with a mural project in their arms. The city moved in its ordinary increments, and yet a seam had been stitched. "You ever think about not doing it?" Isla asked, tucking a strand of hair behind an ear, a question that was both childish and importunate. Marin considered the brief ache that would always be there, and the fact that the ledger had taught her a strange, useful lesson in how private choices ripple outward. "Sometimes," she said, "but then I think about the library roof, and the garden, and your class's mural. Those things matter." Isla smiled and handed Marin a crayon. "Let's draw a street where everyone shares the bench." They drew together, the lines sometimes shaky, sometimes certain. It was a small ritual, the kind that made home into a public project. A neighbor walked by and knocked, bringing fresh scones. The house smelled of browned butter, of lemon zest, of the city's incidental kindness. In the years that followed, Marin kept a routine that included evenings of workshop teaching, mornings of paperwork and grant oversight, and a Sunday when they would make soup for neighbors who needed extra warmth. The Foundation's transparency portal published regular reports. The city's ordinance required disclosures that made plaques speak of donors and conflicts, rather than leaving names as shimmering enigmas. Sometimes people would ask if she felt vindicated. She had complex answers.
Vindication was a small word for the work of rebuilding trust. The ledger had been an instrument. It had made a private betrayal into a public question of stewardship. In that way, the work that followed was less about settling old wounds than about constructing systems that would prevent similar concealment in the future. The leather-bound notebook remained a quiet archive piece, an object that had catalyzed change and then been folded into a larger story.
Marin would periodically check the Foundation's files and see the label that read, Evidence Number 1, Notebook, and feel the strange closure of work done. On a late spring evening, when the community room's windows were full of people, a class on participatory budgeting, a table of young planners drafting pocket maps, a pair of elder neighbors arguing gently about trees, Marin stood and made a short announcement. She invited any who wanted to help plant a new row of street trees to meet the next weekend and offered a small stipend from the Foundation to cover supplies. Afterward, as people drifted out into the bluing sky, someone asked Marin a question that made her smile. Did coming home a day early ever feel like fate to you? She considered the question as she locked up the community room, the metal click echoing like the safe style from months ago. It felt like a choice, she said, a practical decision that turned out to be consequential. It's not fate. It was a decision I made in a small, tired hour, but choices matter. Isla, who had been hanging a paper banner that read Truth Matters in crooked letters, hopped down and put both hands in her mother's. We did good stuff, she said plainly. Marin tightened her fingers around her daughter's small, warm hands and looked out at the street. The city's light had settled into an ordinary hush. For all the legal paperwork, for all the depositions and settlement language, there remained a kind of quiet repair that could not be measured in ledgers alone. Conversations resuming at neighborhood meetings, children learning the names of local trees, a bench with a plaque that now listed both donor and the transparent conditions under which it had been paid. If someone were to ask what made the difference, Marin would not say heroics. She would point, without dramatics, to the mundane work. Photographs taken in order, a chain of custody signed by a mother and her parent, a technician who understood how to make a file immutable, an attorney who insisted the law be used not as a weapon but as a tool for truth, a journalist who preferred verification to spectacle, and a community that, through small acts, rebuilt what had been shaken. She had come home a day early from the hospital, and the house had given her evidence. That evidence, carefully preserved and translated into public language, had not simply broken a life. It had triggered a sequence of accountability that widened into public reform. The ledger's small numbers had become measures for change. On the stoop that evening, Marin watched a child plant a tiny tree in the median strip across the street. The volunteer group from the Foundation laughed as they camped soil and tied ribbons. The tree's sapling leaned into the evening wind like a new argument for future shade. Marin put her hand on Isla's shoulder. We'll keep watching the benches, she said. Isla looked up at her and grinned. And label them, she said simply.
They watched as the city, in its ordinary way, kept happening. People returning from their errands, a man walking two dogs, a neighbor closing an umbrella. The house across the street, ordinary with its lit windows, held the echoes of a night of revelation, and also the small transactions of daily life. A casserole passed to someone in recovery, a teenager rehearsing for a school play, an old woman knitting in a window seat. In the quiet that followed, Marin felt something like a settlement between the private and the public. It was neither perfect nor total. It was, instead, a sustained practice. Keep the records, follow the money, let the evidence speak, and build institutions that make future concealments harder. It was what a planner would call resilient design applied to civic integrity. Before they went inside, Marin took a last look at the corkboard where Isla's drawing had been pinned. The crayon street had a bench with a plaque that read, Remember Truth, and under it, in Isla's careful hand, For Us. Marin folded her daughter into a small, fierce hug. The future, at least in their neighborhood, felt like a street they could work on together. If the city had to tell a story about that small turn, the day she came home early from the hospital, it would say perhaps that chance and choice meet in curious ways. But Marin, who had lived the hours and counted the receipts and signed the chain of custody forms, knew the simpler truth. A person's quiet, deliberate choice to preserve evidence and to seek accountability can remake a horizon. It does not erase pain. It does not always bring justice in the public's moral language, but it can make dignity legible. At dusk, the windows of the house glowed like a promise. The community room's lights spilled out, and on the sidewalk, a neighbor hugged another and promised to join the planting party the next morning.
The ledger, the legal papers, the settlement documents, and the Foundation's charter sat in folders that could be read by anyone who cared to look. The public record now matched the private one in ways it hadn't before. Marin switched off the porch light and closed the door to the house that had once betrayed and then steadied her. She had come home a day early, and because she had chosen the slow work of documentation and the even slower work of reconstruction, she had been able to turn private rupture into public repair. It was not the end of everything. It was the start of a practice that, in small, deliberate increments, would make the city's honors and its money speak in the same language. If you want to learn more about the Foundation's work or find resources on preserving records and understanding civic accountability, please visit the Foundation's page linked in the description and consider subscribing for updates on community grants and workshops.